Hi everyone, let's make a start then. There's a few more people still trickling in the lobby, but let's get cracking. So welcome everybody, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this Thought Leaders Forum hosted by ASI on getting the best value from UK climate finance. I'm Annika Burke from ASI and really delighted and excited to welcome you all to this today. So just as background, the ASI Thought Leaders Forum series is a series of events that we run where we share knowledge, foster collaboration and share best practice across the international development sector. So just to let you know, this session will be recorded and it will be shared online after the event. So please do just keep your cameras off and yourselves on mute, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions a little bit later in the session. So the topic today is around, as I said, getting the best value from UK climate finance. And we're going to be sharing some of the findings from a study that we did for DESNZ, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, late last year. This was a piece of work done by ASI, Carbon Trust and the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development in the Netherlands, where we really looked across the range of sectors and technologies, particularly focused on mitigation, to look at what the barriers are. We looked at cost effectiveness, we looked at development impact to really say, what's the best bang for your buck from UK ICF spending. This piece of work built on an earlier study that was done in 2020. So we spent a bit of time refreshing that analysis and looking at what have the key trends been in the last few years. So really exciting and interesting, and I think even more relevant and important given cuts to the ODA budgets that we've seen over the last few months. So even more important that we really get the best value from every pound that the UK government spends. So just in terms of the agenda, what we're going to do today is I'll pass across to Lindsay Napier shortly, who's a Deputy Director at DESNZ, for some opening remarks. And then we'll have a short presentation on the main findings from the study, and then have some comments and questions to our panel, and then open up for broader Q&A. We've got an hour and a half if we need it. We'll see where we get to. We've got plenty of time for conversation. So before we dive in, let me just introduce the panel. Don't know if you'd like to put your cameras on, everyone, so we can see you. So we've got Lindsay Napier, as I said, from DESNZ, who's Deputy Director in the ICF department, and she's a leader in international climate and development programmes with a specialism in private sector solutions. Then we're going to hear from Matt Savage, who is our team leader on this assignment, who's a global expert in climate finance, who's been working in this field for over 20 years and has shaped some very large climate programmes around the world. I'm sure many of you have come across Matt. Then we have John Ward from Penguin Associates. He's an economist and strategist and has advised many governments and institutions around the world on climate action and finance. Then we have the lovely Lindsay Hibbard, second Lindsay of the day, who's an Associate Director at Carbon Trust. She's a climate policy specialist leading in UK net zero strategy and Paris Agreement negotiations. We then have Andries Hoff, who is an environmental economist and modelling specialist who comes across from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And then we have me. I'm Annika. I'm a senior manager over here at ASI and have spent much of my career working on development economics and delivery of large climate programmes. So that's who we are and that's what we're doing. I will head across to Matt now to tell us a little bit about what we learned from this piece of work. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Annika, and fantastic to see so many people here in the middle of August, when I'm sure you could all be doing something more enjoyable. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, just giving a few high-level findings of the work that we did with the team for DESNZ. Can we take the slides forward, please?
Sorry, Matt. We actually supposed to go to Lindsay first.
Oh,
That
sorry,
was
to
my
Lindsay first.
fault. Sorry,
Okay.
Lindsay. Sorry, I hadn't seen you there. Lindsay, do you want to give us some opening remarks from a DESNZ point of view?
Yes, certainly. Thanks so much.
Apologies.
No, not at all. And I think you can never have too many Lindsays. So great to see another one on the call. No, thank you so much for everyone for joining today. I think Annika set this out well. We are in a changing context. This report was produced in 2024 with a follow-up to the 2020 report. And I think the context has changed significantly over that past year with the announcement of the cuts to the UK's aid budget. So this report, I think, is, as Annika said, relevant, and in fact probably even more relevant now given that changed context. So I think we're all aware the UK government is committed to delivering our £11.6 billion commitment in international climate finance by the end of this financial year. But we also remain committed to providing international climate finance in the future and to playing our part alongside other developed countries and climate finance providers to deliver our international commitments. I think importantly, this government recognises that tackling climate change and nature loss internationally is in our national interest in terms of increasing our energy security by reducing dependency on fossil fuels, enhancing UK food security by protecting and stabilising food production and supply, and also, importantly, driving economic growth at home and abroad by accelerating the green transition. So I think we need to ensure that those international climate commitments are even more effective now in this kind of era of constrained odour, so that we create even greater impact and ensure even better value for money. And our focus really needs to be on maximising the catalytic impact of our precious odour to mobilise far greater sums of finance from the private sector. I think we also need to work more closely with other donors and funders to ensure alignment of efforts, coordination and complementarity in what we do. So to sort of come back to the report, it's just so important in helping us consider how best to do this. DESNZ takes evidence extremely seriously. We're committed to using evidence to inform policy, and this report gives us the critical evidence base needed to prioritise and focus our approach, ensuring that every pound delivers for the UK taxpayer and the people we support, and also that it works hard to leverage additional finance. This evidence gathered under the research has helped inform our internal strategy and our planning processes, which cover the pipeline of our programmes and work, which will be funded under the government's multi-year spending review, which was announced earlier this summer. And that will then in turn shape our objectives and priorities for the UK's international climate finance phase 4. So just to thank ASI and Carbon Trust, and also Utrecht University Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development for the work, and really looking forward to engaging in this discussion. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Lindsay. Okay, Matt, over to you.
Thanks. Like I said, if we can go forward one slide, please, I'll just give an overview of sort of what we're doing. As Lindsay has said, this work that we did was an update from an earlier report from 2020, which I know some of the team were involved with. And I think it shows what Lindsay was saying, that there's been a sort of an evidence base to the programming around international climate finance by the UK, which has sought to draw on evidence and prioritisation approaches to ensure that concessional money is directed towards the right sort of instruments and the right sectors. I think it's worthwhile saying a few words about the context since 2020. So what's changed? In some ways, things have got worse. So obviously, we are not aligned with Paris Agreement in terms of the climate science and in terms of the warning. And there's been slower expected progression on greenhouse gas emissions than we had hoped. On the positive side, there have been significant shifts in some technology markets and costs and deployment, and I'll say a little bit about that in further slides. Concessional finance is scaling, but scaling much more slowly than was hoped for, and is under pressure, as Lindsay was saying, from cuts to ODA budgets in developed countries. And therefore, we have this increasing focus on getting value for money, and in part that is around the financial mobilization and leverage potential of concessional public funds. If we move to the next slide, please. So what were we doing in this report? We were looking at a long list of sectors for review, and these covered the power sector, and that was both in terms of generation, transmission, storage, demand side management, land use sectors such as agriculture, forestry, water, end use sectors such as industry, buildings and transport, and then an area of cross-cutting programmatic approaches such as capacity building, innovation, new technologies, for example, such as green hydrogen. And what we were trying to do was to take a structured approach, looking at these different areas where the UK could spend its concessional finance, with a view of trying to understand where the best value would be. Now, we used a number of criteria in order to do this analysis. Partly it's about the size of the opportunity. So that is the volume of greenhouse gas emissions that are available and the timing of those emissions, as well as the gap which exists in order to deliver those emissions. And we call that the size of opportunity. We looked at the cost effectiveness, which in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation is normally the cost per tonne of CO2 abated or avoided. But we also looked at a range of sort of broader considerations. So one is the development impact. These could be the co-benefits for a different range of outcomes, such as health or education or inclusion and gender equality, for example. We looked at the scale of market failures and barriers, about whether there was opportunity to actually solve some of the challenges preventing these sectors from scaling. And last but not least, we looked at UK expertise and the alignment with the ability of UK to bring in its own institutions, companies, technologies in order to contribute alongside the concessional funds. Next slide, please. So, first half of the report really looks at sort of trends over the last 5 years, and I mentioned that greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase. This is especially true in emerging and developing economies. Overall, in more developed economies, emissions are starting to flatten out. But the issue now is sort of shifting towards the sort of middle and lower middle income economies, with most of the emissions growth coming in middle income economies at the moment. In terms of technology progress, we have seen some significant cost declines, particularly in renewable energy, in solar PV, in wind, and also in electric transportation. But there are some sectors which are not scaling, or where the technology costs are not improving as quickly, and you typically see that in areas of buildings or industrial decarbonisation, hydrogen and agriculture. And each sector has its own challenges and barriers. Some are basically around technology maturity, but some are around the sort of complexity of the systems in which they operate, for example, in agriculture. We've also seen nature-based approaches and cross-cutting approaches, such as innovation, just transition, increasingly in focus as enablers of other sort of sectoral gains. So we're starting to see a shift away from sort of pure plays on energy generation, for example, as the low-hanging fruit, and into a broader set of programming and technology areas. And this is partly because all of these sectors will be necessary if we are to meet 1.5 or Paris-aligned decarbonisation targets. From a financing perspective, the needs remain significant, and the most recent estimates indicate up to $10 trillion of financing for low carbon development by 2030. But we do see that current flows remain only a fraction of that. They're dominated already by private finance with a smaller public component, but they do tend to be very concentrated in developed markets. So approximately 90% of those flows go into developed OECD markets and into a certain subset of technologies, such as energy generation and light transport. So a lot of countries and a lot of sectors remain underfunded. We have seen the growth in stronger political commitments, although that is now being increasingly challenged, particularly with political developments in the US, which are giving cover for more resistant and fossil fuel oriented regimes to push back against climate ambition. But the show is still on the road, and there is still progress on the political front. It is true that there are a number of persistent barriers which have not yet been solved. So carbon pricing remains challenging across countries and sectors. Access to finance, political instability associated with pandemics or conflict remain huge challenges in actually having a concerted push towards low carbon development. Next slide, please. If we look at the sort of priority sectors, I think the first thing I'd say is there was a general level of stability between the analysis that was done in 2020 and in 2024. So a number of sectors that you might expect to be seen as high priority remained high priority, such as solar, for example, energy storage, forestry, agriculture. And these are sectors where there's big opportunity, quite low costs of mitigation, and the potential for significant development impacts with some level of UK expertise. There were a number of changes in the sectors that we prioritised. For example, transmission and distribution became more important in our priority list, and that's primarily because it's emerging as a key barrier to the further scaling of renewable energy. So the grid constraints have become more important over that period. Habitat restoration, likewise, is now being seen as a more important source of emissions reductions, particularly in terms of the size of opportunity. The science and understanding of habitats has improved, as well as the increasing links to biodiversity financing and the alignment of climate and biodiversity finance. Innovation support, for example, became more important. And that is essentially a story of understanding the remaining technology barriers to low carbon development, particularly in heavy industry, in hard to abate sectors, such as heavy transport, and the need to sort of focus on new solutions. And that might include things like green hydrogen, or around carbon capture and storage. So there is strong opportunity for sort of techno-industrial innovation if we're to meet the 1.5 aligned targets. So some stability, some changes. I think the best way of looking at the opportunities is rather like a slow-moving supertanker. So a lot of the solutions are well known and already quite well understood. And the question is, at what point do you start phasing in support in order to capture those benefits? Some sectors like solar are obviously quite mature and offer the potential for really significant mitigation benefits over the short term and across a large number of markets, whereas other sectors are emerging. And I'll say a little bit more about how we're looking at different sectors from that development perspective in terms of their relative attractiveness in both current and future climate investment. Next slide, please. So this is a model that we've been using to try and understand what effective climate mitigation spending looks like and how we tie it, as Lindsay was saying, to transformational pathways. The diagram that you can see on the right is often used in terms of technology innovation or market innovation, but essentially it's what we call an S-curve. And things start on the bottom left at the lowest point, and you're looking for opportunities. So in this case, mitigation opportunities. There's a relevance to your policy goals. And then you would start looking at what are the systemic barriers that are preventing that change, and that would normally be around policy or capacity type activities, the lack of innovation or demonstration opportunities, early technology investment, behavioral change, and a lot of work goes into trying to unlock those early, more systemic barriers. You then go up the curve, and as your demonstration and piloting begins to take off, then you start to scale those technologies, and you'd find that a lot of the mitigation technologies are already moving into that space, particularly EVs, solar, wind, for example. They're definitely in a scaling phase. And then you hit a sort of adaptive sustainability plateau where you revisit and revise your financing and your development approach. It's important, I think, for each of the sectors that we're looking at to understand where you are on that curve, because that really then determines the type of support that you give, whether you're doing innovation or capacity building more at the bottom of the curve, or if you're doing financing approaches towards the top of the curve. And that's also true of different country contexts. So it's also true that in a middle income country, for example, you might find that solar PV is right at the top of the curve, that it's scaling, and that most of the regulatory barriers have been addressed. But if you go to some of the lower income countries or sort of conflict areas, you might find that those regulatory frameworks or supply chains or market frameworks are not in place. So you have to focus more on the capacity, innovation, demonstration side. So it's not, even within a single sector, it's not a one size fits all as to how you should best spend your money and what sorts of interventions should be delivered. If we go through to the next slide, please. There were some sort of high-level reflections on how best a donor such as the UK, as DESNZ, should therefore structure its climate portfolio. The first point I'd like to make is really that it's useful to think of international climate finance as a portfolio of interventions. And that means that you can do different things within that portfolio. It doesn't all have to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So there are both short-term and long-term decarbonisation priorities that that DESNZ and the UK might feel are important. In the short term, we may think that it's important to deliver a high volume of low-cost emissions reductions in order to respond to the urgency of the climate science, that we need to get ourselves back on track with Paris alignment. But at the same time, we may also think that for the 2030s and 2040s, it's important that we start to unlock the harder to abate sectors, which will also be important for meeting Paris commitments. So heavy industry, for example, or heavy transport, or forestry and agriculture, which have proved relatively difficult to push forward. So you can balance out these different priorities within your portfolio and have a portion of the portfolio which targets lowest cost, highest value emissions reductions, and a portion of the portfolio which looks at both longer term innovation, but which also perhaps targets countries which are less carbon intensive now, but which have the potential or which are rapidly industrializing, which have strong population growth, and which are likely therefore to become locked into high carbon pathways and become bigger contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the medium term. So a portfolio of competing priorities, I think, is the way to go. There's also the need, I think, to combine sort of large-scale funding with sort of smaller scale, more adaptable, flexible innovation support. So the evidence is that large programmatic interventions in middle-income countries have the potential to deliver really significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions. However, those sorts of programs don't deliver the sorts of innovation which you might typically need for those longer term challenges. So having a pot of funding which does both, again, is a valuable way of structuring things. The third point is around knowing when you've done enough. There are some perverse incentives built into climate finance institutions and donors in needing to show that you are delivering large-scale emissions reductions. So the donors, the international financial institutions, all have to show the value of their portfolio. What that can mean is that you start chasing the easiest projects. So it would be quite easy for DESNZ and UK ICF to put all of its money into providing semi-concessional support for commercial solar plants, for example, in middle-income countries. The question is, does that really add value? Is that the best use of UK concessional support? And the answer to that would be no. And there are certainly markets now where, and technology sectors, where the UK and others should be withdrawing. And certainly within middle income countries, sort of solar PV or electrification of sort of two-wheeler or four-wheeler systems in some Asian markets, these are areas which are being commercially driven now, and there is no need really for ongoing concessional finance, even though it could be easily deployed. The final point on the portfolio structure is really around how you maximize synergies. So if you think about climate finance as a way of moving through that S-curve from innovation, systemic change to scaling, you need a strategy that can follow through both sectors and markets, and you have a structured approach and know when to hand off from capacity building to policy development, to innovation, to scaling and de-risking approaches. The second point I'd like to make is really around instruments. What we're seeing is a shift from direct project financing, where the donors where the donors would take quite a large stake in projects or programs, towards more risk-sharing approaches, which are structured around guarantees, and that's a particularly good use of funds as market mature, and as private capital comes in, and there are certainly sectors where that's possible. That also has then implications for the sorts of policy work that you're doing. So in many middle income and lower middle income countries now, the policy frameworks around climate change are much more mature than they were 5 or 10 or 5 years ago, certainly. So you can start to focus your policy support and capacity support really around the enabling of private finance in more advanced sectors, and moving away from modelling or target setting around mitigation pathways. The third point here is that as those markets mature, you can really then have a focus on investment. So if you go to Brazil or Mexico or Indonesia, of course there are still capacity challenges, but the main discussion now between the governments and the IFIs and others and private sector is really on how do we get this stuff built. So who's going to pay for it? What are the risk regimes around public and private finance? So that again becomes the main focus. It's supporting investment rather than sort of research and insight or policy frameworks per se. The final point on instruments is that although some sectors are maturing and already have their own momentum, there is still a hugely important role for donors like the UK to contribute to the international climate finance architecture, whilst recognising that it needs ongoing reform and evolution. Without a level of solidarity in terms of the climate finance architecture, whether through the Green Climate Fund or the Climate Investment Funds or the GEF or others, then we're likely to see a greater fracturing of the political environment and greater lack of willingness in middle and lower income countries to move quickly, particularly on mitigation investment. The final point I'd make is really about thematic focus. So as certain sectors mature, what you see is the emergence of new areas or emergent areas of programming. So for example, in the energy sector, there's less justification for supporting renewables rollout now and electric vehicles, but issues and opportunities like smart grids and addressing some of the transmission and distribution infrastructure, which are enablers to scaling, they become more important. So you can see donors and IFIs moving their focus upstream to some of the underlying infrastructure. Innovation for hard to abate sectors. This remains a challenge. In the decarbonisation pathways, it's always the case that some areas of mitigation are kicked down the road for delivery in 2030, 2035, 2040. But the work needs to be done up front in terms of how you do heavy transport, what role green hydrogen will play, how carbon capture and storage will work, or potentially in more innovative technologies as well. So that still needs a level of ongoing investment. In terms of the sort of land use sectors, this remains a really challenging area, partly because land use, forestry and agriculture are caught up in really quite complex social and economic systems. So the barriers to to change, and the incentives around those sectors are more complicated than they are for pure technology sectors like transport and energy generation. So these sectors are a slower, have a slower development progression in terms of their effectiveness and in terms of being able to achieve the potential mitigation potential. And that requires just a stronger and more sustained focus on how we deploy carbon markets across those sectors, for example, or how we integrate nature and sort of ecosystem valuation into those sectors. The final piece, which has become more important, is as climate transition, energy transition has moved from being a theoretical idea, which was pursued by sort of experts and policy people like us. It runs into more real world opposition, both in terms of phase out of fossil fuels, but also in terms of the cost implications of the transition across different sectors. And even if the costs of inaction are greater than the costs of action, there are nonetheless costs of action. And those fall often across different groups and across different timescales in ways which create both social and political opposition. So what we see is a sort of greater investment in just transition narratives, not only in countries, for example, like South Africa, where there is no sort of coal to clean phase out, but across developing countries, just to ensure that there's both political and social buy-in to that transition. So if I was to summarize, I'd say that things have moved. There have been developments, certainly in some energy sector technologies and in transport, but things are moving too slowly in order to reflect Paris alignment. There are shifts in the opportunities that we think should be looked at into sort of harder to abate sectors, innovation, for example, sort of grid enablement technologies. But there is also some value in running a portfolio approach where you're doing a range of things. You're trying to get the low-hanging fruit as quickly as possible, but you're also investing in the future and across a range of country environments to make sure that we avoid lock-in. So I know we've got a sort of an interesting panel discussion coming up, so I'll leave it at that and hand back to Annika.
That's fantastic, Matt. Thank you for giving such a clear and strategic presentation from what is a very techie and in-depth and systematic piece of work, actually. So really brilliant to hear your kind of high-level recommendations there in particular. And we will share the link as well to the wider report, so those that want to get into the kind of deeper analysis sector by sector can do so. So we've got some great panel members here. I don't know if you want to pop your cameras on. It'd be great to hear from some of you, some of your reflections and thoughts on some of what we've heard, and we can open up to wider questions shortly. But I will abuse my position as moderator to ask a couple of questions to kick us off. I mean, we've heard a lot already today about being catalytic around the role of the private sector, and I think that's so critical and that's so important here. I think what maybe is on many of our minds as we listen to this analysis and take it in is around, Matt's points earlier around commitment from governments, and I'm interested to hear from the panel members around, how do we square the kind of $300 billion commitment that was made at COP29 with falling odour and with the kind of rollback we've seen, particularly coming from the US on kind of climate. How do we square that with our ambitions? And so what do you see as the role for the UK, in the architecture, in the international architecture here? And, from what you've heard and from your own backgrounds, where do you think we should really be focusing that energy on that precious odour, as Lindsay called it? Who wants to dive in? Maybe John.
Oh, Lindsay, I wouldn't want to get in the way of a Lindsay, so
I'm very happy. I just thought I could give a perspective, but I'm very happy for John to go first.
no, please, you go.
Great. I mean, I think, Annika, you know, it is a real challenge, but we know that. I mean, I think the report comes out saying that UK government ICF is only 0.1% of climate mitigation flows. So, you know, our spend is really very minimal in comparison to what we are trying to achieve in terms of that $300 billion per annum. So it really is it's about sort of two things from the UK government's perspective. It's about mobilising that greater levels of private finance. It's only through that private finance that we're going to achieve these goals. So it's how do we use our finance to de-risk private investment? And I think that's through a range of tools. I mean, Matt's just sort of spoken to several of them, but I think it's potentially about using blended finance or public-private partnerships. It's about shifting from grant finance to a far greater reliance on guarantees. And it's also about, you know, developing innovative new instruments and programs. And one of the examples that the UK's really pushed is the CIF capital market mechanism. And that's the first multilateral climate fund to raise investment capital directly from capital markets. So there are these kind of innovative initiatives where we can use small amounts of our funding to help and to push, and that's expected to raise $7.5 billion. So that's on one side is the kind of the programmatic approach, but then I think you're absolutely right. It is about that kind of greater global coordination around the international climate finance architecture and really getting that architecture to work well for us. And pushing the multilateral development banks to stretch their balance sheets further and do more with the money that they've got. And I think, you know, the Prime Minister has committed us to a multilateral approach and multilateralism. And I think, you know, recognising that and just making that system work as well as we can is so important. We know that, for example, for every £1 that the UK puts into the World Bank's IDA, it leverages £4. So it's kind of using these mechanisms that work well as much as we can.
I knew it was a mistake to let Lindsay go first. She stolen all my talking points, but I'll just jump in with a few quick thoughts, which largely are kind of, a lot of it is kind of echoing some of the thoughts Lindsay had there. But I mean, kind of the obvious answer to this question, which people will kind of immediately leap to, is around the role of leveraging the private sector. And I think for everything that everybody has talked about in terms of guarantees and risk absorption mechanisms and instruments, I think are really important. There are lots of academic debates about whether the low carbon transition is more expensive than status quo, but that, you know, you can argue about that until the cows come home. But what I think is undeniable is that it's definitely more capital intensive. And we know that costs of capital in low and middle income countries are very high, much, much higher than in developed markets. So things that we can do to bring that cost of capital down through these sorts of risk mechanisms are going to have kind of outsized importance in leveraging flow. So I really would echo that point, I think, being as critical. I do also think that the point about using the balance sheet of the MDBs, the multiple sources of leverage that we can get from that, both on their balance sheet as money goes in and they can raise debt, and then as they spend those resources, does seem to me to be crucial in terms of scaling up flows. And then perhaps, and then linked to that, all the stuff which has been looked at recently about how MDBs can perhaps make better use of their existing balance sheets with some quite geeky things relating to accounting standards and things like that. I think just one other thing I might throw into the mix, not so much about how to spend money, but about perhaps additional sources of raising it. I do think that the climate that we're seeing now does mean that the debate, which kind of was really loud a few kind of 10 years ago, gosh, showing my age, around alternative sources of climate finance, solidarity levies, looking at how CBAM revenues might be used, alternatively looking at aviation, looking at the international maritime sector, and thinking about how that can be a source of revenue for climate finance. I think that's going to have renewed importance as we kind of contend with this challenging context. And then final point is, I know the question was framed in terms of 300 billion, but I think it's important to remember that the actual target really should be 1.3 trillion. And we should not let ourselves kind of forget that in the angst of how we're going to raise money in the first place.
Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant point. Good. I mean, so just moving on a little bit. I mean, I thought it was really good, interesting, Matt, your point about, where on the S curve, where do we stop and where is the sweet spot? And I'd be interested to hear from others on the panel. I don't know if Lindsay H, if you have insights on this, or maybe Matt, you have more to say, or Andres, if he's on the line, around, which of the technologies are on the sweet spot there where they might not need the support anymore. And I thought it was really interesting, your point about like the incentives of donors to kind of keep working along the curve so that we start to see the results. But actually, from what we've learned, which technologies do we think actually are kind of managing on their own now and are starting to reach that sweet spot? Hi, Andres. Do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, sure. If Lindsay can, Lindsay, feel free to jump in if you want. Yeah, so this is not a question that you can answer easily. It's a very dynamic thing, and it changes over time, and it's also different for different regions, right? We don't have all the capital costs the same across regions, and also the benefits. It's simply we don't have equal wind everywhere, so it's a very question that depends on circumstances, which is an obvious answer if you ask scientists such a question. But I think in general the most important thing is having the markets there, right? That you have to create a market that it becomes for companies interesting to invest. And maybe this is a very good example is to look at wind offshore here in Europe. Not a few years ago, it was no problem. If there was a tender, there were a lot of companies who want to buy offshore wind farms. And now it's very difficult to do so. And that's only partly to do with higher building costs. Material prices may be gone up a bit, but it's mainly due to it's like a system problem. So on the one hand, we have built a lot of wind farms, but the demand for electricity has not been increasing so much as we might hoped for. That's because industry decarbonization lags a bit behind, right? There hasn't been so much demand for green hydrogen. And of course, the wind where you can use wind offshore is either produced green hydrogen or directly electricity, but also electrification is a bit falling behind. So the greening of the industry has to go one-on-one on the supply side of electricity. So it's really a system approach, and that needs to be. So it's very hard to look at one kind of technology. You really have to look at the whole system, and that's I think key here. So and of course there's reasons also why industry doesn't go to decarbonization routes, because we have this congestion problems in electricity grid. So we also need this transmission and the grid expansion. That's also a key factor. So there are different factors you have to, and they're all dependent on each other. So you really have to look at the system and see, okay, how can we improve the system further? So only look at supply of electricity doesn't work. If you increase the supply, you also need a demand, and that also you need the electricity grid to increase. So it's a combination of factors. Where I think that the most, if you see where is the biggest role for government, I think it is in this increasing the transmission, right? The electricity mix, the grid extension, because that's not something that can be done by private companies. So you have to really look at where is the role of the public sector here, very, very big, and that I think that's the big question in the larger system perspective.
Yeah, I think I had similar thoughts on the kind of systemic approach. I think we definitely see it with innovation across the board in every market, that there's still this kind of dip in investment between kind of your technology readiness level kind of 5 to 8 or so, where even in like the private sector is not willing to kind of step in and take that risk, and so there is de-risking mechanisms that is needed. And obviously this gap is bigger and is deeper in emerging markets where more support is needed in that space. And so where we've seen the particularly effective ICF programs have been those that really do consider the whole of the capital chain, kind of going along those technology readiness levels and supporting both at the kind of very early stage innovation and to scale up, but doing that all in the context of what the investors are going to are looking for and are going to need to see and are interested in, so that once you have market ready technologies, which we obviously do in a number of sectors now, you have also the investment that that is kind of coming in and aligned with that. I think the Carbon Trust supported looking at the power and transport sectors as part of this refresh. I think with solar in particular, we've definitely seen that the movement from obviously solar costs have continued to decrease rapidly, and many of the that's not such a barrier to deployment anymore. It's more around that kind of grid integration and building out the grid alongside. So those looking at both battery storage and transmission and distribution infrastructure as part of that kind of enabling technology to ensure that those kind of solid technologies, looking at wind and solar, can be deployed in the most cost-effective way within the system that works for the system that we're operating in, is really important. Obviously, we've continuing that long-term support and technology trajectory is also kind of really key. And to Andrew's point about the US, what we saw with the change of the kind of administration in the US and the withdrawal of support for offshore wind in the US is that kind of knock-on impact for investment internationally and the loss of confidence potentially in that market. And we don't know how long that might take to rebuild, but you can see that things kind of happen quickly. So the ability of the ICF to where it can be as kind of agile as possible to be able to react to these kind of changing circumstances. Sorry, Matt, I'll let you come in.
You're on mute, Matt.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think it's really useful to try and differentiate between the technology costs, which may be very competitive, and the enabling environment challenges that may be associated. And battery storage is a really interesting case in point, because essentially the market for grid scale storage is actually now very developed. The technology is great. It can actually be very competitive. But what you're talking about now are setting up market systems for sort of pricing of storage. So it's really an enabling environment issue that needs to be focused on. So even though the technology itself is commercialized and being deployed incredibly rapidly now certainly across developed and middle income markets, there's still a huge amount of work to do in terms of deployment on the market side and doing demonstration work in lower income countries, first of a kind demonstrators, for example.
I think that's a really good point. I think what's really struck me from this conversation is it's been about going back to your point about a portfolio approach, Matt, and in doing this work, we were thinking very much in terms of the DESNZ portfolio, but I think you can broaden that out to talk about the ICF portfolio spanning across FCDO and DEFRA as well. And of course, lots of the work that the FCDO does with its ICF spending is around the market systems and around grid expansion and about that more enabling sort of environment type work. So I think that's a useful perspective to have, to look at the ICF kind of as a whole, although with DESNZ it's often sort of slightly more technology focused, but actually we are part of a bigger portfolio. We haven't spoken much about geography. And I'd be interested to hear from the panel around your thoughts around targeting. I believe the approach at the moment, or has been in the past with DESNZ, has been around really targeting kind of large-scale decarbonisation in some of the biggest emitters. Like, do we think that's the right approach? Do we think that that's the best sort of value for money, given sort of limited resources? And should we be scaling back on some of the sort of smaller countries, less fossil fuel dependent countries? What do you think on geography?
I mean, I'm happy to sort of give my thoughts. Yeah, and let others come in. I think whenever a donor spends money in countries that look to be as wealthy and which are faster growing than the UK itself, so the BRICS, then it's very challenging from a sort of public relations perspective. Why are we giving money to these countries with space programs, whose economies are booming, etc.? And that's a very difficult case to make. But the truth is that the major emissions growth is in 6 or 7 middle-income industrialized countries, and without, if you're in the business of solving climate change, then you have to get those countries to decarbonize as rapidly as possible. And in some cases, in some sectors, that's happening, but in other cases, it's not. So I think there's on sort of environmental policy objectives, there is a rock solid case for continuing to operate in those markets and to look to operate at scale, both in terms of investment or working on policy reforms that deliver scale of investment. I also think, given the rapid industrialization and growth of a set of lower middle income countries, that there is a strong case to build capacity and to nudge investment towards pathways which avoid low carbon lock-in. So you're both trying to solve the next 5 years in the middle income countries, but you're trying to ensure that you don't then, by only doing that, give yourself a problem from 2030 onwards, where where essentially the emissions problem has shifted to a different set of countries who perhaps have lower capacity and more challenging markets. So you need to do both at the same time, and there's a solidarity benefit, I think, to working in both a small group of high emitting countries and a broader set of lower middle income countries, which is also important for the Paris Agreement and alignment, and for the general push on maintaining the climate finance architecture. If you just focused on a subset of higher income countries, it would soon fracture the alliance that is trying to underpin progress on solidarity and progress on Paris. I don't know if any of let's see, Lindsay, you have some thoughts, and then John.
Lindsay, then John.
I think what we've seen is some really interesting kind of regional leaders that have been quite dominant and kind of supporting and shaping kind of climate narratives of their region. And so I think that there could be definite benefit for the UK to think about what are the kind of catalytic countries in particular regions that could really help support the decarbonisation of those regions more broadly. We've got a lot of kind of shared frameworks that some countries have really spearheaded in terms of investment, but definitely to the point in terms of the challenge of not wanting to invest in countries that do potentially have the finance to be able to be supporting this, but using the UK's convening power and the other levers that we have in terms of supporting the development of those frameworks, using our kind of extensive knowledge and expertise in a number of policy areas where the kind of UK has led the way. I think thinking about these catalytic countries as well as kind of catalytic technology areas could be quite interesting to maximise impact.
Well, I fear I'm about to lose some friends and colleagues from FCDA with this comment, but I do wonder whether in a context of declining ODA budgets, as we were talking about before, whether there is a case for UK climate finance to kind of accentuate the impact, the focus it is having on technology development. And I know this is something that Desnes has already been very strong about, but thinking about some of the work that, some of the tools that Matt was talking about before in terms of S-curves and kind of perhaps technologies which are at the beginning of the steep part of that S-curve, and thinking about how the UK's climate finance can kind of really accelerate progress in developing those technologies and stimulating those technologies, kind of independent of any particular geography, or and then use the multilateral architecture that we were talking about before to really do some of the heavy lifting in terms of working out how these get deployed at scale in the individual countries. And it just, you know, kind of links to some of this debate we've had recently, or some of the discussion that's been had around sensitive intervention points. And maybe there are opportunities for the UK to be playing a role in stimulating technology development, which can cascade out across 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 countries, but using the footprint of other organisations to really do some of that heavy lifting, some of that hard work, with the UK kind of being slightly more upstream in terms of stimulating those technologies in the first place.
I don't think you're going to lose too many friends, John. Good points. Good points. I'm just going to ask one more question before handing over to the floor. So please, those on the call, do have a think about your questions. We talked a bit about some of the barriers. Matt, you talked to some of the barriers that are in place for some of these technologies moving up the S-curve, I suppose, as we're thinking about it in that language. From what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, which barriers do we think are coming down, and which ones do we think are the hardest to remove?
So again, I'm happy to sort of jump in with a starter and then let my more learned colleagues chip in. So I think in the power sector, it's obviously the cost barriers for generation technologies and storage have come down quite significantly, and we've moved towards a world of integration and grid bottlenecks, sort of land access, supply chains, critical minerals for the sort of technology development side, permitting delays. So it's become less of a technology play and more of a supply chain, supply chain and integration issue on power. I'd say on transport, I mean, the shift in EVs has been huge and will only accelerate from now on. So the main focus, I think, is in mass transit within the transport sector, along with sort of charging infrastructure in lower income countries for 2 and 4 wheelers. On industry, I think things have changed less. So technology costs remain high. Issues or approaches like buyer clubs within industrial sectors have not sort of scaled quickly enough. And I think people know that there are technology solutions in different industrial subsectors, but there's essentially a lack of risk and a lack of risk appetite and capital to pursue those. There's a lack of confidence in the sort of long-term viability of electrification or alternative technologies. And then likewise in land use and agriculture, again, I think the issues and barriers haven't changed significantly. It's still around governance, sort of land tenure, incentives, leakage, value chains. And that's really just to do with the social and environmental complexity of land use sectors, and the extent to which there is the political will or political capacity to engage in good governance and enforcement of those sectors. So forest loss has remained largely flat over the last 5 years. We've in no way sort of solved it or really made a dent on that sector. but maybe other colleagues have a view. So I think rapid progress in some areas, but certainly challenges remain.
I think the thing I would add to that, I'd agree with all of that. I think one of the things which perhaps is at risk of becoming worse, especially in the very recent past, has been around some of the politics and some of the political economy of transition, for all the reasons Matt was talking about earlier around the just transition and social issues and socioeconomic issues. I think that's really critical. I think the other aspect of it is that the broader kind of international salience being given to climate has declined, and that means often climate and environment ministries are finding it even more difficult than perhaps they were before to kind of get traction domestically. I'll mention a country I'm working in at the moment completely anonymously, but it's got an NDC and it's trying to work out how it might expand its ambition on its NDC, and it hasn't. At the same time, there's an energy ministry which has got an IRP which has actually blown the old NDC budget completely out the window. So we've got a climate and environment ministry trying to get a more ambitious NDC, and then an energy ministry who's developing energy plans without any reference to the existing less ambitious NDC. And I just think that some of that's a reflection on some of the more challenging political context in which many domestic constituents are trying to push forward climate action.
And if I can just say one reflection on that, I think there's always been a danger of splintering in terms of the climate ambition agenda if it becomes too detached from the reality of the transitions and the sectors and the line ministries who actually deliver policy. And that is beginning to fray a little bit. And there are either two ways that can be solved. Either the groups who are working on climate ambition have to stop talking about unrealistic 1.5 degree pathways and scale down to the reality of what's possible politically and technology wise at the moment, or we have to find much better ways of scaling up ambition in the real economy, and that means taking on sort of vested interests and having much more effective ways of deploying technology, and maybe both of those are going to be necessary as part of just holding together the narrative and the coalition.
I think it's all still fundamentally dominated by economics, isn't it? Where we've seen kind of mass expansion of renewable technologies is because it's cost competitive and it's easy to roll out. It's an easy decision to be made. So I think still focusing that's going to be the prime way in which you're going to get scale across these markets, is if you can make the economics work and the investment proposition attractive. And then countries are going to take advantage of the transition. We've seen those countries that are thinking about scaling their green hydrogen production to be kind of exporters of green hydrogen in the future, not necessarily to decarbonise their own grids, but as an economic opportunity for exports. So I think we have to keep anchoring it in the kind of economics and potential to really get that scale.
Very well said, Lindsay, thank you. I want to open up now, we've got 20 minutes left, so I want to open up to the floor for those of you that might have questions. I can see Nick's put his hand up as number one. Others, please do pop up your hands. Now, I think there should be a way for you to be unmuted to be able to answer your question. So have a go, otherwise Rayhan, I think, can do it for us.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you for the panel and for the insights given so far. Really interesting study, and I was pleased to play a bit part in it last year. Two questions. One for Andries on the subject of carbon removals. how much does the modelling behind this study depend on BECCS and DACS, and how realistic is it that direct air capture and other carbon removal technologies can scale in time to reduce emissions, given we're seemingly already moving beyond 1.5? And second question on policy for whoever would like to address it, as what are the lessons of JETPs and country platforms as compared to smaller scale bilateral TA and investment, recognizing that JETPs do bring scale and portfolio approaches, but also bring institutional barriers to effectiveness? Thank you.
Shall I have a go for first?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So I think the model scenarios have changed a bit in the last couple of years especially regarding BECCS. So earlier model scenarios, especially the ones that went to 1.5 degree, I think they relied more heavily on BECCS, negative emissions in general, than later scenario studies, and that's because also due to the criticism and the problems, of course, with especially large scale bioenergy production. As you just simply have to use enormous amounts of land. And of course, an alternative is to put this land and other uses, for instance, just growing food or feed, depending on the future diets. But in a way, we are still depending a bit on BECCS, and that's simply because our goal is to get to net zero greenhouse gases, and it's very, very difficult to get to net zero for methane, for instance, so the most important greenhouse gas after CO2. And that's simply because if we don't change our dietary habits, then we will. It's very difficult to have purely technology changes and reduce methane to zero. That's just simply not possible. Cows will produce methane if they are alive. So in that sense, you need some kind of compensation to get to net zero. And it can either be reforestation, which is also costs, of course, a lot of land. And it can be, depending on how you do it, it can be good or bad for biodiversity. But BECCS simply in the models, it's a very cost-effective way. So I think the main reason why more recent scenario studies have lower BECCS, it's because we assume strong restrictions on bioenergy production, and based on literature on how much is still feasible, also looking at biodiversity and food security constraints. So there are most scenarios now just put a limit on bioenergy use, thereby also limiting BECCS. But most of them also go to this limit, so they don't rely less on BECCS. They really make use of the limit you set it in the model. And sometimes it can also be zero, but then you have you have to go very, very fast down to zero and do a lot of reforestation to make that possible. And of course, the question is, how feasible is that then again? So I cannot really say anything about the feasibility. Maybe the only thing is mentioned already by Matt, I think, right? The 1.5 degree. That's of course not feasible in any case anymore without a big overshoot, because we're already almost there. So it's a question of how much overshoot do you need, which is the target we're going to have. But if you really want to go back to 1.5 degree by the end of the century, it's just very difficult to disregard any technology that is able to do so. And disregarding any technology will make it just more expensive.
John?
So I'm definitely not going to talk about modelling of BECCS. But just on your second question, Nick, so on JETPs, I think that my view is that the emphasis that they place on providing a convening tool or something for development partners to coalesce around, I think is incredibly valuable, and I think is something but is going to be even more important moving forward with all the conversation we've already been having around kind of the risks of fragmentation and the need to ensure coordination to deliver value for money in a more constrained environment. So I think that convening power is really important. I would say I'm not sure that it's the only tool that is available in the toolkit to support that coalescing of development partners. I think there are other means we can do this, climate investment plans, even things as simple as development partner coordination committees that provide some of that coordination, perhaps at a significant lower, smaller fraction of the cost of JETPs. That said, of course, JETPs do create the extra kind of political limelight. I think my reflection on where these have kind of run into trouble is that because of that limelight, often they kind of sit somewhere outside of conventional public financial management, public investment management processes, and therefore feel a little bit alien or a little bit outside of the kind of standard processes which countries are otherwise using for their investment planning, their development planning. And that I think looking forward, it's kind of, this is a really geeky point, but the more we can do work to kind of get the plumbing between the kind of the specialness of the JETP platforms and existing country mechanisms for making decisions over investments, making decisions over what the budget's going to be over the next few years, making decisions over prioritization of investments. The more those two national versus international processes can actually be joined together, the more effective I think they're likely to be.
If I can just follow up on that, I agree. The reason why you need JETP is because countries themselves have not been able to create a convening platform and a docking station for the international partners to arrive and allocate their finance into credible investment programs that then flow through to the sectors. So the international community has to create a sort of a slightly interim platform to fulfill part of that function, which isn't country owned. And I do think the next phase of national capacity evolution will be for the larger countries to actually build and own that architecture themselves in a way which is credible enough for donors and IFIs simply to pass through capital with the expectation it will be effectively and efficiently allocated to the NDC processes. And certainly for the climate funds are looking at this as well. So the Green Climate Fund and the shift to sort of country level systems, but that's going to take time. And in the meantime, the downside of the JETP is it does become bureaucratic, and you're forcing multiple donors and IFIs to work together with different processes and approval timelines in a way which can really sort of slow things up compared to individual programs or institutions. Lindsay.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple of points. I mean, JETPs aren't led by the FCDO, so it's not our particular area. But I think it's really important to recognise particularly that kind of country-led approach, and that's definitely an approach that is being backed through the government's approach to development assistance. I think that's going to become ever more important. So, I undoubtedly it's an ambitious, challenging approach with and it's been, as you say, Matt, there have been challenges in terms of bureaucracy and speed. I think back to the point that was made earlier about the importance of the political economy. They are particularly they face particular challenges in a difficult political economy in a difficult political economy environment. So we're not seeing the speed that we would have liked, but I think the approach remains one that definitely the UK government wants to support, and clearly it's one of the biggest challenges in terms of, the most kind of urgent energy transition challenges of moving away from coal. And the only other thing I would say is just, again, in a kind of context of constrained ODA, we need to be thinking about both, how we can get the most impact with the ODA we have. So having that kind of focus on just transition, I think, is so important, bringing together the kind of climate and development angles.
Can I say just one more thing about the JETP?
Yeah, go for
it. So JETPs were created in a political context, partly as a response to UNFCCC and COP and trying to persuade coal-intensive countries to retire coal, and partly around COP26 and UK efforts. And because they were created in that political context, they've inherited a sort of political importance, which means they've become part of the climate negotiations as well, about the fairness of international contributions and the 100 billion and 300 billion target, and whether the developed world is actually going to deliver on promises. So they have an outsized importance, and they become a political football in a way that normal climate finance programming doesn't. So people aren't contesting the work of the GCF or sort of bilateral programming or the CIF in the same way that they will contest JETP as the sort of the global answer to climate justice and sort of equity considerations within the COP process.
Very good point. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So let me just open again to the floor. Let me just see if anyone's got their hand up. Last chance. Celia, would you like to come in with the last question? We should be able to, Rayhan should be able to unmute you.
Oh, hi, sorry, there it worked.
There we go.
I've just popped a question in the chat a little while ago, but I'll just read it out loud for the panelists to hear. My question is, how can UK ICF catalyze systemic change in emerging markets, particularly where enabling environments are fragmented or weak? Thanks.
I'm happy to.
Do you want to have a go at that last one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to step in. So I think whenever you're going into a low capacity environment, then most of your work is going to be on sort of institutional plumbing, policy, incentives, behaviours, capacity and demonstration at most. What I found is that when programs have tried to go into markets where the capacity is low or where the market risks are high, what ends up happening is that you're using concessionality of your finance to offset risks which aren't purely climate risks. You're trying to offset poor governance or conflict or market risk in a way which may or may not be a good use of environmental concessional climate funding, and there becomes a need to then over-subsidize solutions in order to make them work in the market, or demonstration projects which have then no chance of attracting private capital downstream if they were to try and replicate without similar levels of concessionality. And you start to lock yourself in to long-term subsidy regimes which rely on external support, which may not be sustainable. So I think, yeah, sort of internal plumbing, regulation, policy, capacity, demonstration, and then work on some of the technologies which are already commercial, such as solar PV, for example, or light transport, with a view to building markets which can then scale in those contexts. But anything more complicated than that is basically asking for trouble, in my experience.
So at the risk of asking for trouble and or disagreeing with Matt a little, I don't really disagree with that at all. I think it is crucially important that all of those sorts of steps are taken and that sort of enabling environment is built. I think the thing that has struck me from however many years of kind of looking at these things is that trying to do that capacity development and that technical assistance work in the absence of the prospect of capital funding is a fool's errand, because nobody wants to go to another workshop on grid balancing or something like that on a Friday afternoon if it's optional, or if you can't see why it's relevant to actually leveraging capital into a country. So I think kind of trying to find the balance where we have these potentially sequenced, but nonetheless packages of technical assistance and capacity development work combined with the prospect of capital support, and then get into all sorts of debates around conditionality and all sorts of challenging things like that. But it does seem to me that looking for those combinations of support is likely to be more successful than just trying to do technical assistance work in and of itself in isolation of any real prospect of being clear when that's going to leverage capital funding.
Lindsay, do you want to give us a final thought
just very
before
quickly,
we close?
Just to say that having worked for many years on business enabling environment, I couldn't agree with John more strongly. I think, if you look at the work of Lant Pritchett and others about deals versus rules, actually putting a sort of enabling environment in place that then isn't actually used and tested by contracts and commercial activity is not the best and most effective way to use funding. So I think really important to tie it to the capital, as you say, John. Thanks.
And just, I don't agree with that. I don't disagree with that at all. And just to say, if you look at the success, say in the climate investment funds and the SREP programme, which focused heavily on perhaps not the most fragile contexts, but certainly on lower middle income contexts and energy transition, it was really the package of the promise of $100 or $200 million of capital alongside the technical assistance and reform to do first-of-a-kind projects. I think there are then questions about whether those first-of-a-kind projects turn into second-of-a-kind or third-of-a-kind projects. But certainly in terms of getting traction on enabling environment reform, the capital is very important.
Thanks a lot, and I think let's kind of bring things to a close there in violent agreement as we are on. As kind of at the same place where we started, I think in some ways around, this question really is around, we know that the odor, this precious odor, needs to be catalytic, and the question for us now over coming years is how do we make it even more catalytic, and how do we put our minds to that to leverage those much larger volumes that are needed. So brilliant. This has been a really stimulating and fantastic discussion. So thank you again to the panel for the conversation and to all of those that were involved in the underlying analysis of the report itself as well. So as I said, we will email everyone out and share the replay and share the link to the report as well. So I hope you enjoy getting stuck in and reading it. Thanks very much, everyone. Great to see you, and hope to see you again for another one of these Thought Leaders Forums sometime in the future. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.